Welcome to the ExecMBA podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. On this episode of the podcast, I'm excited to share a solo pod from me with 5 application tips for ExecMBA applicants who are targeting our final application deadline of the year. That's for our class that's enrolling this August 2026. Our final application deadline is just around the corner, July 10. And I thought it'd be helpful to record just a few tips for those of you who are working to finalize your application materials. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. And as always, if this conversation is helpful for you, please like this episode and subscribe to the ExecMBA podcast so you never miss an update. Remember, you can always check the episode description for links to Darden blogs, social channels, and more. Now, without further ado, here's 5 application tips for candidates targeting our July 10 Executive MBA deadline. Well, welcome to the ExecMBA podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and as we approach our final Executive MBA application deadline of the year, July 10, I thought it would be appropriate to share just a few application tips for those of you who may be working on an application. We host all kinds of webinars and we have blog posts and all these kinds of things to help you get organized as you approach the application process. But thought maybe 5 application tips for you to keep in mind as you work on your materials might be helpful for those of you who are targeting our final application deadline for our Executive MBA class of 2028. Of course, that's the class that will enroll this August. As I mentioned, the deadline is July 10. There's no particular time on that day associated with the deadline. Anytime on July 10 is just fine. So let's get into the application tips. So the first thing that you'll hear from us is the application process is a storytelling exercise. This is a pretty common point we make as an admissions committee. And it gets candidates to not just think about the elements of the application as discrete parts of the application, but rather working together as a whole to tell the story. And there's 3 key dimensions to any successful application. There's the personal, the academic, and the professional. And most candidates tend to undervalue the personal. And so as you kind of think about your story and the story that you're telling, you want to make sure that these elements are represented throughout your application. Most candidates tend to think, oh, it's business school. I need to emphasize the academic and the professional parts of my story. And while important, that's not the whole of your story. There's also who you are as a person. And I think a very easy way to think about this is to think about the learning experience here at the Darden School. It's case method, it's participatory, it's discussion-based. Students are engaged in a conversation in class. So your perspective, your experience, what you've seen to date is going to shape not only your learning experience, but the learning experience of others. And so I share all of that as context to get you thinking about how the elements of your application are working together to tell a story, because it's very much how our admissions committee will review your application. We're not reading one part of your application and stopping, and then another part and then stopping. We're reading all of it together as a whole. And hopefully that whole is working together as a composite to tell a story about who you are and who you'll be in the Darden somewhat The other thing, somewhat related to this, and this brings me to my second tip, is to think of the application itself as an initial introduction to who you are. And the reason for that is you're not going to be able to share everything about yourself in the application. You have a fixed amount of space. There's parameters, limitations. We're only asking certain kinds of questions. And so it's worth doing some work as you're getting organized for the application process, or even as you're working on your application, to think at the end of the day, what do you want to make sure that our admissions committee learns about you through your application? What do you want to make sure you share through this initial introduction? If you can use that as a frame, I think that will help you develop a list of application priorities, again, across those 3 key dimensions, the personal, the academic, professional, to make sure you're being as intentional and strategic as you can as you're filling out your application. That kind of gives you a checklist as you go through the application elements and say, all right, have I covered this? Have I covered this? Have I covered this? So you can be as thorough and thoughtful as you assemble your application materials. It's also worth noting that there's no perfect MBA applicants. Everybody has strengths. Everybody has aspects of their candidacy that they wish were stronger. That's just the reality. But candidates oftentimes when they're applying, they're comparing themselves to some kind of idealized MBA candidate in their mind, and they worry, oh, I don't have this particular experience or this particular background. That's okay. We're trying to get to know you as you. And so the more intentional you can be through the application process, the more you can really help us get to know you, the better, right? Because we're thinking about you as we're reading your application. We're thinking about you in class. We're thinking about you on a learning team. What kind of classmate, what kind of teammate are you going to be? How are you going to contribute to the community here? The great thing about Darden's Executive MBA program is it has this really holistic element to it, right? You have the opportunity to be engaged in the classroom and also engaged outside the classroom. You may know we have 10 student organizations. We have a number of interest groups. We have opportunities for student leadership. All of these things are there if you're interested in them. But the students who come to our Executive MBA program are not just here to get a degree and move on. They are here to be part of a community. And so as we're reading your application, we're trying to get a sense of who you're going to be in that community. And so the more thoughtful, the more intentional you can be as to how you think about telling your story and advancing your application priorities as you're assembling your application materials, the better. All right, so that brings me to my third tip. And this is maybe not so much a tip as just a way to kind of think through an element of the application. So you may know if you've been looking at our executive MBA application for a little while, or maybe doing some research on our website, we are test optional for our executive MBA program, which means candidates who are applying to this program do not need a standardized test to apply for the program. Um, One of the things to keep in mind is that this is a choice for each candidate. I will say most people applying to the executive MBA program apply without a standardized test score. And I think that has something to do with the career stage for many candidates, what they've experienced to this point. A typical executive MBA student, at least on average, will have about 11 to 14 years of work experience. Although, when you think about the broader executive MBA class profile, we'll typically have students for maybe 5 years of work experience to 25 plus years work experience. So, all manner of individual contributors to mid-level managers to even senior executives. I find that most one of the most common misperceptions about the executive MBA program is that people sometimes think you have to be an executive to do this program. The answer is no, you do not have to be an executive to do the program. It's not a target student that we have in mind. When we say executive, we mean more of a schedule that you do alongside work. It's a weekend and evening based schedule for students. But executive does not mean a target student, as you can judge from that work experience profile. It's 5 to 25 plus years. We have people from, again, all ranges of experience along that continuum. And so, as you think about this, standardized test or not, what we encourage candidates to do, we kind of do an audit of their background. Think about those elements of your candidacy that can help us understand your readiness for the experience at Darden. It's worth noting that everybody at Darden is going to take a core curriculum followed by electives. The core is the same across all of Darden's programs. It consists of 10 subject areas, and then you move into electives, and our executive MBA students take 12 electives. And so, as admissions committee, when we're reading someone's application, one of the sort of threshold considerations for our committee is if we're going to admit someone to the program, we want to feel confident that they're going to be able to do the work that they're going to be asked to do academically. And so, as an applicant, your challenge is to make sure you're giving us enough information to be able to make an informed and confident judgment that yes, if we admit you, you can be successful here. And so, when you think about this audit, you think very broadly about the elements of your application and candidacy that can help us understand your readiness. So certainly things like GPA, undergraduate GPA, the nature of the courses that you took, the arc, the trajectory of your academic performance over the course of your undergraduate career, all relevant here. Have you done a graduate degree? Typically, about a third or more of our executive MBA students have completed a prior graduate or advanced degree. What about non-degree related coursework? You think things like Coursera, MBA math, things that are not specifically tied to a degree, but nevertheless an opportunity to learn and maybe even have relevance in an MBA program or curriculum. You also have professional certifications, things like CPA, CFA, PMP, et cetera. List goes on. But those typically involve a test and having to study and prepare for something and even maintain that certification through additional education. There's also the nature of your roles and responsibilities over the course of your career. Sometimes candidates think, well, what if I haven't done something that's purely quantitative? Well, it doesn't have to be quantitative necessarily, but what about analytical? What other sort of processes or approaches have you used over the course of your roles and responsibilities that might help us understand your readiness for this experience? As you can see, that's a pretty broad assessment and audit. And we encourage candidates to think through that. And many candidates, and this has been our experience with executive MBA applicants generally, many candidates will go through that and will say, you know what, I feel like I have enough evidence here. I'm going to lean into my existing background. I'm going to apply without a test score. And about 80% of our applicants in our executive MBA pool apply without a test score. And then a number of other candidates will do that assessment. They'll say, you know what, for my own peace of mind, to feel like I'm putting forward my strongest application, I'm going to go take a standardized test. And that's about 20% of a typical executive MBA applicant pool here at the Darden School will apply with a standardized test score. Now, if you're thinking about a standardized test, it's worth noting that we're test agnostic. We accept a number of standardized tests. We view them all equivalently. Most popular with applicants for the executive MBA program is the executive assessment, which is a 40-question, 90-minute test, probably about 20 to 30 hours of preparation on average. If you compare that to, say, the GMAT or GRE, that's much less prep time than you see for those tests. And it's also a test that was originally designed with executive MBA applicants in mind, and designed as more of a test of readiness rather than a test of aptitude. But we also accept the GMAT, the old and new version. We accept the GRE, MCAT, and LSAT, and we even accept older or expired test scores for any of the tests that I've just mentioned, provided that you actually have documentation of your score and score report. Because, of course, if it's an older expired test, you won't be able to get your score report from the testing service anymore. So I share that as a framework to approach this decision. I will say, as we talk about our final deadline, right? This is in the context of our July 10 deadline. Most candidates at this time of year don't feel like they have a lot of time to go out and take a standardized test. They're applying, the hour is late. They got a few more days until the deadline. And so if you're thinking about that, make sure you take full advantage of the elements of your application that can help us understand your academic readiness when you lean into your existing background. And I mentioned there's a number of candidates who already make that choice across our applicant pool, regardless of when they apply. But I think particularly this time of year, candidates feel like, gosh, I don't feel like I have time to go take a standardized test. What can I do? You just want to be really intentional and sort of thinking broadly about what in your background can help us understand your readiness for the experience here at Darden. As mentioned, core curriculum followed by electives, a core that includes both quantitative and qualitative courses. All right. So my next tip, or maybe sort of topic to explore, is choosing a recommender. So first tip is, well, we only require one recommendation, and I would say as we get close to the final deadline here, July 10, right, last time to apply for our class enrolling this August executive MBA class enrolling this August 2026. People feel really time crunched, and the recommendation process tends to be one of the slower parts of the application process. Well, why is it the slowest or slower? Well, one, it's the one part of your application that you're not filling out. You are filling out the rest of your application, but you're asking someone to be your recommender. And so you're kind of on someone else's time. Now, it's worth noting what our recommendation process is and what it isn't. So, our recommendation process is completely electronic. So, once you put your recommender's information into your application, they should receive an email with a link to our recommendation materials. Now, make sure you check in with your recommender maybe a day or two after you've added their information into your application just to make sure they got that email. If you find out they did not receive the email, drop us a line at that's EXECMBA at darden.virginia.edu. We'd be happy to resend that link to your recommender. Now, your recommender is going to be asked to fill out our recommendation materials, which consists of a ratings grid where they're going to rate you across a number of dimensions, and then three basic questions. The questions are: how do you know the applicant? How's the applicant compared to their peers? And what's one piece of constructive feedback you shared with the applicant? Now, in the working professional programs, executive MBA included, our preference is to hear from your current supervisor. Why your current supervisor? Well, we want to know that you're talking with people at work regarding your interest in participating in this program. You're going to need their support as you go through this program. You're going to have to miss days of work. That's the nature of the design of our program. It's really important to have your managers buy in. Easy way to demonstrate that to the admissions committee is by having your manager be your recommender. Now, I will also share, though, the number one rule when it comes to choosing a recommender is choosing someone who knows you well. So if you are in a new role or you have a new manager, that person doesn't know you particularly well, probably not the best choice for your recommender. So maybe it makes sense to choose a prior supervisor. Now, you hear me emphasize supervisor with current, prior, because we want to hear about people who know you from a business setting, right? This is business school. We're trying to get a sense of your professional experience and identity. With that said, I also find that when you think about the questions that your recommender is going to be asked to respond to, friends, neighbors, colleagues, family members, not really well positioned to respond to the ratings grid or really what's the questions that are on the recommendation materials. Which you think about that second and third question. How's the applicant compared to their peers? That's kind of a 360-degree view on an organization, people at comparable points in the organization. And then the final question: what's one piece of constructive feedback? We find that just colleagues and friends, peers, et cetera, don't give a lot of constructive feedback. But you know who does? Managers. And so we want to hear from someone who's managed you. Now, we do run into situations where someone's an entrepreneur, doesn't really necessarily have a manager. Maybe you think about a partner or a mentor at that point. But if you do have a manager, ideally we're hearing from your current manager, current supervisor. If that person doesn't know you well, choose a prior supervisor. If you choose someone other than your current supervisor to be your recommender, another tip is to make sure you use the additional comment section of the application to explain a little bit more regarding your recommender choice. We give this advice around choosing your current supervisor to be your recommender in a lot of different places: our website, blog posts, and webinars. So if you choose someone other than your current supervisor and you don't explain it, it's going to raise a question for the admissions committee, like sort of like a moment where we'd like, I wonder why they didn't pick their current supervisor. The additional comments section is your opportunity to explain the why of that decision, and so that we can have more information. If you don't explain it, we can speculate, but you really don't want the admissions committee to be speculating on that. And so the additional comment section is 250-word text box at the very end of the application. It's a great space to kind of provide additional explanation on anything that you think is ambiguous or unclear or would just benefit from additional explanation. Common uses of the additional comment section of the application include, recommender choice, tough class or tough semester in college. Maybe you didn't do quite as well academically as you'd like, and you feel like you have additional context to share. Maybe a gap in employment, or you moved around pretty quickly between a series of jobs, and you want us to understand a little bit more the reason for that movement. Anything that you think we might have questions about, or a neutral kind of third party objective reviewer might have questions about, that would benefit from additional explanation. That is why the additional comments section of the application is there. Now, a couple more things about the recommendation process before we move on. Again, completely electronic process. And so once you've finish your portion of the application, you do not need to wait on your recommender to finish their recommendation materials. You can go ahead and press submit on your application. Your recommendation will associate with your application as the recommendation is received. Once your recommender submits their materials, you would receive an email notifying you that your recommendation has been submitted. And then you would also notice that the red X next to that person's name on your application status page will have changed to a green check mark. You can have a second recommender. I think that can be tricky as we get really late in the cycle, approaching the final deadline, right? We don't have a lot of time. We only require one recommendation. And so that's all that's really necessary to make a decision. Adding that second recommender kind of adds another layer to your application in terms of getting everything in. I mean, we can move you through the review process with just one recommendation. And so, yeah, asking that second recommender, you really want to only add that if you feel like there's a perspective that's absolutely essential to be represented within your application. If without that perspective, your story would somehow be incomplete. You want that person to be adding something new to our understanding of who you are and who you're going to be here in the Darden community, not just echoing what the first recommender had to say. So remember, only one recommendation is required. Choose someone who knows you well, ideally your current supervisor. If you choose someone other than your current supervisor, use the additional comment section of the application to explain a little bit more. And then last but not least, if you choose to add a second recommender, just make sure that person is bringing something new to the conversation and adding to your story, not just echoing your story. And then we're going to talk finally about the interview process. So this is both informative and also a little bit of a tip. So bear with me through this. But interviews in our executive MBA application process are by invitation only. And when we're thinking, sort of think about the elements, sort of review here. How does all this work? So the very sort of initial sort of quick review that happens right around the deadline. So in this case, July 10, we'll take a look at the applications we received, and there'll be an initial review to basically determine interview invitations. And the frame for that is, do we think there's a chance that this person could be admitted to the program? If the answer is yes, that person would receive an interview invitation and be invited to schedule their interview. The application is then sent along to a first reader who reads the application materials and makes a recommendation of admit, waitlist, or deny. So they send it along to a second reader who can't see what the first recommender said, but the second reader can see the application itself, can also see any interview notes, and they make a recommendation of admit, waitlist, or deny. And then they send the application along to a third and final reader who can see what the first and second reader noted, and they make a recommendation of admit, waitlist, or deny. And then there's a committee meeting. So all this happens in a relatively compressed period of time. If you think about our July 10 round, right? So we have a July 10 deadline. We have a target interview window, which is July 13 to 16, in which we'll conduct most, if not all, of the interviews for the round in question. We have a decision release date of July 22nd. Official notifications will come out around 5 p.m. Eastern time on that day. And for anybody who's slated for an offer admission, they would also receive a scholarship notification or the outcome of the scholarship review at that same time. And then they'll have until July 27 to finalize their decision. So pretty compressed at this time of year. Things are moving quickly because, of course, the start of school is right around the corner on August 10. And so when we think about the interview process, right? So there's that sort of initial review that happens, determine interview invitations. So you're invited to interview. So you should know, one, that this is going to be conducted virtually. We find that this is the easiest way for busy working professionals to conduct an interview. You don't have any of that stress of like, is it in person? Is it virtual? If I can only do virtual, does that seem like I'm not that interested in the program? None of that, right? We find it's much easier just to get people, everybody's interviewing virtually. It's via Zoom. It's one-on-one with a member of our admissions committee. Darden's interviews are perhaps a little bit different from other interviews that you've experienced. First of all, they're conversational in nature. No behavioral questions in this. Tell me about a time when, or some more specific kind of behavioral type interview question. This is really a chance for you to tell your story. And in our interview process, the interviewer does not read the applicant's application in preparation for the interview. They also do not have a copy of your resume in front of them. That's very intentional. We want the interviewer to come to this interaction without a lot of formed ideas about who the applicant is or their strength as a candidate. The interviewer is there to learn about you from you. And of course, the interview is an incredible opportunity for them to hear firsthand your story, but also for them to get a sense of some things that may be harder to judge from the application alone, right? Your presence, how do you relate to others? How do you communicate? How do you express yourself and share your ideas? We again, in this process, we're thinking about how you're going to show up in a Darden classroom, what kind of teammate you're going to be, how you're going to show up in the Darden community. And the interview, it's 30, 35-minute conversation. It's an incredible opportunity to spend time with the candidate and get to know them better. So yeah, I want you to really think about our initial point that we started at, the first tip, right? Thinking about this as a storytelling exercise. So the application, as mentioned, is an initial introduction to who you are. You thought very intentionally about what you want to make sure we know about you at the end of that process. And again, sort of thinking with those application priorities in mind as you fill out your application. But the application tends to be pretty surface level. It tends to be a 30,000-foot view, a mile wide, but maybe an inch deep. And so the interview is a place where you can really add depth to your story. So as you're thinking about the application process and telling your story, you want to be thinking about both of these parts of the application process generally. So the application introduces who you are, and then the interview adds depth. And so the key question for you as you're preparing for your Darden interview is why? Why have you made the decisions that you've made that have led you to this point? It's not the what of your story necessarily, right? That's important, but you want to go a level deeper than that. And this is where the introspection and self-reflection that really differentiates an exceptional interview from more of an average interview comes in. So I'll give you an example. So let's say you start talking and say, I grew up here. I was always passionate about engineering. I decided to go to college here. I started my career at this company, and then I moved to this company, right? That's informative, but it's a lot of what? What it's not telling us is why you made the decisions that you made. Why did you pick that college? What was interesting to you about engineering? How did you figure out your major once you got there? What other majors did you consider? How did you decide to start your career at that company? Were there other career paths that you considered? How did you ultimately land on the path that you've chosen? The more you can bring us into your process and help us understand the why of your story, what's led you to make the decisions that you've made that have led you to this point, the better. And that makes for a stronger interview. Because again, remember, the what of your story is really reflected in your application. Again, of course, your interviewer has not read that, but for the interviewer to be able to bring something novel to our understanding of your story, that is why the why becomes so important. They're going to write up what you talked about. It becomes part of your application. And the more depth you can bring to your story in that interview process, the better their evaluation is going to be, the more additive their evaluation is going to be. And so and you always want to come as well with maybe a question or two prepared. It's something that's ideally a little deeper than something you would get from the website, where the interviewer can perhaps offer a unique perspective or really add something to the research that you've done. We don't ask in our application a why Darden question, but you should be fully prepared to speak to not only why Darden, but why this particular program. And in the best interviews, that why Darden question is sort of gotten beyond sort of surface level considerations. The person is actually sort of metabolized their motivations, what's interesting to them about Darden into their own life, and they're able to express that in a very personal way. And it's clear that they're excited about this. When people ask us, what are we looking for? What differentiates a strong applicant from maybe just an average applicant? Well, first of all, it's someone who knows their story, right? We talked about how that can work across the application process, not just in the application itself, but also the interview, right? So they've done the work. They understand their story. They understand why they want to get an MBA, but they are also really excited about Darden. And they have clear reasons for why they want to get an MBA, but also why they want to be at Darden. And they have a vision for where they'd like to go in their career, short term, long term, right? We ask this question in the short answer questions of the application. Like, at this time, what are your short term and long term goals? In as many words, this is, of course, something that we'll spend time on in the interview process. Now, look, We're very clear that we know that people's career goals and interests evolve and change over the course of an MBA program. This is about self-discovery. This is about transformation. What you think you want to do at the start of the program may be very different from even what you want to do 3 or 4 months into the program. That happens. But at the application stage, what we're listening for is, have you thought about this? Have you given this thought and attention? Has there been is there logic to what you're saying here? Does it make sense? Does it seem like you really put some energy towards us? And do we feel like we can help you get where you want to go? These are all things that we're thinking about. At the end of the day, as I mentioned, we're really focused on getting to know you as a person, what your classmate, teammate you're going to be, how you're going to show up in the Darden community, and what your motivations are here. And again, we're looking for people who are excited to be at Darden. The last thing that I'll mention here as we think about, this final application deadline is just things move quickly at this time of year, right? July 10 is the application deadline, decision release date less than 2 weeks later on July 22nd. So if you're applying in this round, know that if you're admitted, you're going to have until July 27th to finalize your decision. So that's about 5 days. And so you want to be doing as much research as you can between now and then to learn as much as you can about Darden. And so where to start, right? There's the website. We'll have some events between now and then. You have the podcast. We have a blog, Discover Darden. Always happy to connect with a current student if that would be helpful to you. We have a form where you can initiate that. And of course, you can always reach us at ExecMBA at darden.virginia.edu if there's a conversation that would be helpful to you. But if you can work along parallel paths, right? You've applied, you're working through the evaluation process, but to continue that research and to continue to learn about Darden along the way is really helpful because things do move quickly this time of year. And the one thing I just want to underscore, and probably the reason why we're recording this session, is that you're not alone as you go through this process. Our team, we view ourselves as counselors. We are here to help you make the best decision that you can make. We want to give you a chance to learn as much as you can about Darden, so if you can really figure out if Darden is where you'd like to pursue your MBA. So don't be a stranger. Let us know how we can be of assistance. We always stress with candidates, give us an opportunity to get to know you, whether it's just participating in a one-on-one conversation. We basically have conversation times with our team available daily, coming in for a one-on-one consultation, which is the in-person meetings that we offer here in Roslyn, or even just dropping us an email just to introduce yourself as you approach the application process. We love to get to know candidates. And obviously, the application process, we'll get a chance to spend a lot more time with someone. But we always appreciate the opportunity to make a personal connection. So if we can ever be of assistance as you work on your materials, don't hesitate to reach out. But hopefully these 5 tips are helpful to you as you think about putting together an application here for our final Executive MBA application deadline, July 10th. And that was 5 application tips for candidates targeting our July 10 Executive MBA deadline. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything you'd like us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at that's ExecMBA at darden.virginia.edu. Till next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.